please give a warm welcome to Dr. Kathleen Fisher and Perri Adams.
So I'm pleased to introduce Kathleen Fisher, who is the Office Director of the Information Innovation Office, or I2O for short, at DARPA.
And it's my pleasure to introduce Perri Adams, who is a program manager in I2O. She has expertise in both cyber operations and cyber policy, which is a useful and really rare combination. She was also one of the organizers of this year's Capture the Flag at DEF CON. We're here today to discuss cybersecurity and the research that I2O has been funding to help us outpace the evolving threats that are facing our country and our allies. Perri?
So I spend my time thinking about hackers and how they can break into our computers or networks. So when you think of a hacker, it's very easy to think of someone maybe in a hoodie in a darkened room lit just by their computer. But they're probably in an office building under some awful fluorescent lighting. And this is the reality of modern hacking operations. These are 9-to-5 jobs in many cases. And understanding this is critical to defending against these operations. So let's talk a little bit about what the modern hacking ecosystem looks like today. So to start, we have nation-state operations. In recent years, we've seen countries like Russia and China carrying out increasingly sophisticated hacking campaigns. One example of this is what has become known as the SolarWinds attack, which happened in December of 2020. And even if you don't follow cybersecurity news, you may have heard of this because of how powerful it was. Companies like Intel and Cisco and Microsoft were hacked, but it wasn't just companies. It was the US State Department and the US Treasury. And in addition to tens of thousands of other entities that Russia gained access to. But they didn't have to hack into any of the companies I just named. They actually just had to hack into one company, and that was a Texas-based company called SolarWinds. Now, SolarWinds produces a piece of software that's run on all of these networks. And so Russia hacks into SolarWinds networks, and they install a backdoor in the software. And so when SolarWinds pushes an update to their customers, they unknowingly push Russian access into these networks. And we call this style of attack a supply chain attack. You're going after a link in that supply chain earlier than the intended target. And Russia's doing this because they're able to achieve more for little effort. Just hacking one company gets them into tens of thousands. It's not just nation states that are able to carry out more sophisticated operations these days. It's also cyber criminals. So cybercrime, ransomware has become so widespread in recent years, I'd be surprised if anyone here hasn't felt at least its downstream effects. So for instance, if you were on the East Coast in the summer of 2021, you may have been stuck waiting for gas at a gas station because a gas distributor, Colonial Pipeline, had been ransomwared. And in response, they shut down their pipeline. So this was inconvenient to customers, but it also caused them millions of dollars in damages. And the downstream economic effects of this gas shortage were closer to $1 billion. And you no longer have to actually be an expert at hacking to carry out an offensive operation. So folks who don't know how to do this hacking, they can now go and pay someone else to do it for them. There is a thriving hack-for-hire industry. Reuters has done excellent reporting on how some US law firms are going overseas to pay hack-for-hire companies to hack into their legal opponents so they can dig up dirt to use in lawsuits. So you can now outsource it. You no longer have to be an expert hacker yourself. This is expanding who can carry out these kinds of offensive cyber operations. And hackers are outsourcing themselves as well. So in many cases, rather than take the time to develop tools in-house, they're acquiring them from specialized companies. One example of this has been NSO Group, which creates specialized hacking tools to hack into phones. It can take months to develop one of these tools to hack into phones. It requires quite a bit of specialized expertise. And so most folks didn't have this in-house expertise, but now entities and states can go out and buy from companies like this. And we've seen these tools used to target journalists and activists. And further, these companies are not just creating hacking tools, they're building out the hacking infrastructure. They're creating almost a push-button solution for hacking. And in some cases, they're pushing the button themselves. They're becoming a bit of a hack-for-hire operation themselves. You might give them a phone number, and they deliver you access to that person's phone. And so we're seeing this evolution within the offensive cyber operation ecosystem where hackers are becoming much more savvy and they're able to outsource, they're able to basically create these economies of scale that Kathleen is going to talk about.
Right. Yeah, so what's become clear today is that hackers are increasingly organized, centralized, and professional, as Perri was just talking about. So rather than individual hackers sitting at a computer in somebody's basement, instead what we have is groups running operations from office buildings and managing those operations really like a business. For example, this slide shows the org chart of a typical ransomware organization. They have HR and finance departments. They're doing business development and research. And like McDonald's, they have franchises. So rather than doing the actual hacking operation themselves, they often contract out to specialized groups that do the hacking. And those organizations, they have customer service departments that help the victims acquire the digital currency necessary to pay the ransoms. So as these ransomware groups grow and mature, they begin to consider economies of scale. They're able to specialize their labor pool, divide their labor pool, and streamline their production pipelines. But most critically, given the existence of these centralized resources, they're able to do complex cost-benefit analyses about how to best leverage their resources. So it may be easy to think of hackers as having unlimited resources and unlimited power, but they don't. They have to think about how best to use their resources just like we do. So when Russia carried out the SolarWinds attack, right, they were able to compromise 18,000 different companies by hacking just one. So the cost of entering the ransomware business or hacking somebody's iPhone is now significantly lower because of those economies of scale, because those services have been centralized and are now available for a fee. So even though the individualized supply chain attacks or hacking an iPhone is individually a really hard problem because those targets actually have pretty good security, much better security than many other kinds of devices, they still can be effectively targeted because of the economies of scale that exist within the broader ransomware marketplace or the broader hacker ecosystem. So this cost-benefit analysis has shifted the targets that represent the best return on investment for hacking organizations. So now Perri is going to walk us through some of that cost-benefit analysis for various kinds of vulnerabilities. Perri?
So let's use software security as an example to show what this cost-benefit analysis looks like. Not all software vulnerabilities are created equal. Some of them are more difficult or even impossible for an attacker to leverage to gain control over your computer. So we're going to talk about a couple examples on this spectrum of difficulty, starting with the lowest hanging fruit, which is credentials, right? So bad passwords, easily guessed passwords. I hope that everyone here knows that you should not set your password to be password. It's very easily guessed. And so that's trivial for an attacker to exploit. They just enter your password and they're into your accounts, they're into the system, whatever they're trying to get at. And so next, a little bit more complicated, but still what we would consider low-hanging fruit, we have a style of attack called an injection. And so we're going to stick with our example program here. This is just a computer program that's taking in a password as input, but this could be really any kind of input. And so let's say that we give it a password, and password is still password. And once we press enter, what happens is the password is assigned to a variable. But let's say this program isn't checking our password at all. So we might be able to stick a semicolon on the end of our password and then trick the computer into thinking that's an end of a line of code, and then we can put our own code at the end of it so it reads in the password, thinks that that's the end of it, and runs our own malicious code. As you can see here, this really isn't that hard to exploit. And for instance, if you follow cybersecurity news, you may have heard of the Log4j vulnerability that attackers were having a field day with last year. This was an example of an injection-style attack. Attackers love these because they're so easy to exploit. But by and large, the kinds of vulnerabilities that make our world so insecure are what we call memory corruption vulnerabilities. And this is an entire class of vulnerabilities that have a lot of different attributes, but they are very powerful and very intractable. They can give a hacker control over your entire device. But they're much more complicated to exploit than the low-hanging fruit we just talked about. And so I want to walk us through what one of these looks like, a very basic example, because a lot of what we're talking about today has to do with memory corruption vulnerabilities. So we're going to keep with our example program. It's reading in a password. But before it even reads in this password, it has to store the password somewhere. And that's in the computer's memory. Now, memory corruption just means that you're corrupting the memory where everything about the computer program is stored, its data, its instructions, et cetera. And so let's say that our program has to come up with a size for the data for our password. So it says, OK, it's going to be 8 letters. So we're going to put aside 8 bytes. And then maybe we're storing some extra data. Maybe the program's storing some extra data. So it puts aside another 8 bytes to store data. And so we read in, the computer program reads in our password. And then the program might set the data to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so if we go and look in our program's memory, we see that our password is stored in those first 8 bytes there. And then below it, we see the data 1, 2, 3, 4 is stored right there. And so this is what we'd expect to happen. But you'll notice that our program isn't actually checking to make sure our password is size 8. It's just assuming that it is. So what would happen if we, being malicious hackers, gave it 12 A's, let's say? And so if we go and we run the program in the same way and we go and look at our memory, we see, OK, we have 8 A's stored where the password should be, but what happened to the other 4? And if we then look at our data, we see that we've overflowed those first 4 bytes. And that might not seem like a big deal to overwrite 1, 2, 3, 4, but attackers are very, very canny. They're very ingenious. And they can take a 4-byte overwrite. They can take a 1-byte overwrite and turn that into total control of your computer using a lot of gymnastics that go deep into how a computer works. But of course, this is higher cost. This requires expertise. This requires specialization. So attackers are going to go after that low-hanging fruit first. But because of the power of memory corruption vulnerabilities, they are often worth that investment. They're also harder for defenders to prevent than some of those injection or bad passwords that we were talking about earlier. And this is what Kathleen's going to get into next, is that cost-benefit analysis that defenders are performing as well.
Right. So unfortunately, these kinds of memory corruption vulnerabilities are pretty much everywhere. Microsoft and Google estimate that about 70% of the vulnerabilities in Windows and Chrome, respectively, are instances of these kinds of memory corruption vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities, they aren't just running in the software on our desktops. They're also in our phones. They're in our communications infrastructure and our critical infrastructure. So that's our power grids and our sewage treatment plants. They're in our IoT devices. So that's our phones, our routers and our printers and our smart toasters. They're also in our cars and in the planes that many of us flew on to get here to this meeting today. The sad thing is we actually know how to prevent these kinds of memory corruption vulnerabilities using runtime checks. For example, we can confirm that a newly chosen password fits within the amount of space we've allocated to hold that password. The problem is that such checks degrade performance. Now, it may not seem like a lot to check that a password fits within 8 bytes, but that check, it's just the tip of the iceberg. The many, many checks that are required across the millions and millions of lines of code, they really add up. And to date, consumers, they haven't shown that they care about security as long as their computer works. They do care if their computer is slow or if their browser fails to load a page in a reasonable amount of time. So unfortunately, when it comes to a defender's cost-benefit analysis, performance has always beaten security to date. Now, performance isn't the only reason that we see so many corruption vulnerabilities, but it is a big one. So the performance security trade-off represented by these dynamic checks is an example of the larger cost-benefit analysis that we see play out when defenders think about how to allocate their resources when defending a system. In an ideal world, we'd see defenders allocating sufficient resources to defend their systems. But our reality is plagued with bugs in the software running on our computers and in our networks. We don't spend enough money to defend our systems, and the money we do spend isn't effectively allocated. Security is difficult, and consumers consistently demonstrate that they don't buy based on security, making a problem for companies. Ironically, however, as ransomware operations have matured into efficient, effective, and powerful operations, the threat that they pose has altered the cost-benefit analysis. Being a victim of ransomware costs money, sometimes quite a lot of money, as well as causing reputational damage. Those risks have caused companies to change their cost-benefit analysis and spend a little bit more money on security. The groups that are selling hacking tools, they're also having an effect. When these groups produce and sell powerful attacks against the most powerful, latest phones and computers at a rate that's been previously unheard of, that threat is also incentivizing companies to spend a little bit more on security. These are many of the ways in which an improving offense has caused the defense to change how they think about security. So this reality isn't the only reason that cybersecurity is improving. We also know more about how to secure our devices and our systems. We're better educated. We have better tools, and we have better techniques. These advances allow us to reduce the cost of assuring our systems while improving the benefits of having done so. Of course, even with these improvements, offensive cyber operations are having their renaissance, as we've seen. Today's hackers are often canny and very effective. So to compete, we really have to understand their reality. Similarly, we have to understand our reality. We don't have unlimited resources to defend our systems. We have to realize that both attackers and defenders operate in a world of hard cost-benefit analyses, and we can use that fact to our advantage. This reality allows us to prioritize defending systems where they're most likely to be attacked, and doing so without imposing too high a cost. That trade-off is a trade-off that DARPA has been thinking about for a really long time and allowing us to focus our efforts in cybersecurity. So in the next section of our talk, we're going to give you an overview of what DARPA has been doing in this space and their impact. Perri, why don't you get us started?
So DARPA Crash was a program that DARPA started about 10 years ago. And the thought behind Crash was this. If we're seeing a tension between fast performance and security, what if we made it such that those weren't in opposition? What if we found a way to prevent those safety checks, those memory safety checks, from slowing down the performance of your computer? So what if instead of doing those checks in software, we did them in hardware? And so 2 years after Crash started, CHERI was developed. And CHERI is what we call a computer architecture. It's essentially a blueprint for how we would create these new kinds of hardware chips that would allow us to perform these very fast checks. And so let's talk a little bit about what this looks like. Computers use these things called pointers to point to areas of memory. And so CHERI would create hardware that could store extra information about the memory being pointed to. And so if we go back to our example with the password, we see that it's able to store some permissions, the object type, but especially the bounds of that object. So if we're putting in a password that's longer than 8 bytes, we'd be able to do that check in hardware. And so CHERI is designed to do this with little to no performance impact. But of course, it's not enough to just have a blueprint. And this gets at one of the most fundamental things that DARPA has to think about. You come up with an idea, you have an initial concept, but how do you get that out into the world? It's one thing to transition software to end users, but it's another to transition hardware. And so 2 years after CHERI, 2 years after the CHERI blueprint was developed, the CHERI team partnered with ARM, which has actually become one of the primary chip designers in the world. So your phone runs an ARM architecture on its chip. And in fact, Apple has recently moved all of their computers to an ARM architecture as well. So the decision to partner with ARM back in 2014 served to be prescient. Just this year, CHERI had shipped to industry partners boards that included, or sorry, I should say ARM shipped to industry partners like Microsoft boards that included CHERI technology. And this is the evolution of initial concept to real-world impact. What CHERI was asking is, how do we create something that realizes and understands the incentives of both attackers and defenders? Will be something that defenders will want to use because it doesn't degrade performance, but it also targets a class of vulnerability likely to be exploited by attackers.
So CHERI is just a piece of the puzzle when it comes to defense, however. CHERI's not a panacea because there aren't any panaceas when it comes to cyber defense. Cybersecurity requires a multifaceted approach where we layer on different approaches and different techniques to stop the increasingly sophisticated attackers that we see today. When defending reality, we can't live in an ideal world where an attacker will never gain entry. Instead, we have to defend at every point in the attack cycle. So let's start with the first layer in that stack of Swiss cheese, preventing the attacker from getting in. So one of the best ways of ensuring that an attacker can't get in the first place is to use a technique from computer science called formal methods. Essentially, these techniques allow us to prove in a machine-checked way that there are no bugs of certain types in code. In the best cases, we can prove that code is going to do exactly what it's supposed to do and nothing else. Of course, in general, we can't prove everything, but we can choose the things to prove and establish a really high level of trust that the code will behave as intended and that attackers won't be able to subvert the code. However, formal methods is an expensive approach, a high-cost approach, and the most sophisticated approaches right now require PhD-level effort to use the systems correctly. Lowering that level of sophistication of use is a current research topic. But there are still kinds of software where it's appropriate to use that level of effort. Like, let's think a little bit about what might be those systems. So one example might be cars, right? This Jeep Cherokee in the picture was remotely taken over and driven into a ditch by white hat hackers. We might want to use formal methods to ensure that such attacks aren't possible. Or what about autonomous helicopters? It seems like a good idea to make sure that such helicopters are under our control instead of under adversary control. Assuring such platforms is what the DARPA HACMS program did. It tackled the question of whether we could use formal methods to build software for vehicles such as these that would be much harder for hackers to break into. At the beginning of the HACMS program, a red team was given 6 weeks to remotely hack into 2 platforms, an open source quadcopter and Boeing's unmanned little bird, which is often called the ULB. The ULB is a helicopter that can be flown autonomously, but can also take up to 2 test pilots. Now, we had that the red team try to hack into it to establish a baseline security for the system. So no one was surprised that the red team was able to hack in and take over control of the quadcopter, but the Boeing aviation engineers were quite surprised that the red team was also able to take over control of the unmanned little bird. Then the formal methods researchers got to work, and they rewrote most of the software on the quadcopter, replacing about 80,000 of the 100,000 lines of code on the quadcopter. 16 months later, they handed over that updated quadcopter to the red team to give them another run at it. The red team had been following all of the design for that 16 months and had full access to all of the source code, so they knew pretty much everything there was to know about that updated quadcopter. Despite that knowledge, in another 6 weeks, they were unable to repeat their earlier feat. They failed to hack into that quadcopter. DARPA program manager at the time, who was an expert in that kind of red team penetration testing exercise, his assessment was that that UAV was the most secure UAV on the planet at the time. Buoyed by that success, the formal methods researchers and the team in general moved on to the unmanned little bird. Now, unlike the quadcopter, the unmanned little bird is or was proprietary and ITAR restricted, so the formal methods researchers couldn't directly access the code running on that platform. Instead, they had to work with the Boeing aviation engineers and teach those aviation engineers how to use the formal methods tools and use those tools to provide high assurance to the unmanned little bird. One of the key pieces of technology that they used is the SEL4 microkernel, which is about 10,000 lines of C code. That SEL4 microkernel had been previously proven to be fully functionally correct in a theorem prover, so exactly using formal methods to prove that it was going to do exactly what it's supposed to do and nothing else. Now, part of what the secret sauce of the SEL4 microkernel is it allows you to set up isolation compartments, and what happens in one compartment is absolutely guaranteed to not affect what's happened in any other compartment. The team then used formal methods to produce high assurance version of the rest of the system, including the flight control software, the software that was mediating between the communication between the flight control software and the mission control software, and then the communication between the mission control computer on the unmanned little bird and the ground control software. On the mission control computer, they put that high assurance software in a high assurance partition. They put the rest of the software from the unmanned little bird, including the camera and a full instance of Linux, in a low assurance partition. So then at the end of phase 2, the red team was again invited to take another run at the unmanned little bird. This time, instead of being from off the system, they were allowed to start from a beachhead on the system. They were given root access in the low assurance partition. And they were tasked with breaking out of that partition or otherwise disrupting the operation of the helicopter. As at the beginning of the program, they conducted that test while the helicopter was on the ground. Unlike at the beginning of the program, they failed. All they could do was crash their own partition, taking down the camera, but they couldn't disrupt the operation of the helicopter. The rest of the system noticed that the camera partition went down, and it restarted that partition. At the end of phase 3, they repeated that test, but this time with the helicopter in the air, with the 2 flight pilots on board. Fortunately, with the same result, the red team was not able to disrupt the operation of the helicopter. And in addition, the test pilots reported that the quality of the flight with the high assurance software was the same as with the quality of the flight with the previously unassured version of the software. So what this result shows that with the judicious use of formal methods, exquisite artifacts like the SCO4 microkernel, and a high assurance architecture, we do know how to build systems that are dramatically harder to hack into and that are of size that are relevant to the military, et cetera. Formal methods are just one way to produce systems that are more likely to withstand hacking. Another way is to use programming languages that are designed to prevent memory corruption vulnerabilities. Historically, languages that have this property have come with a performance hit. In recent years, however, the performance of some of these languages is starting to produce parity, languages such as Rust. However, even though these languages can increase security for freshly written code, we have millions and millions of lines of code that is written in unsafe languages such as C. And the cost of rewriting all of that code is formidably high. So we asked, what if we could significantly reduce that cost by automatically translating from the unsafe code to safe code, so from like C to Rust? The DARPA LILAC project is addressing exactly this question. Could we automatically translate from unsafe languages to safe languages? And as the project is approaching the end of its first phase, we're already seeing promising results in that direction. So moving on to the fixed layer, even given these advances, promising advances, we're not going to be able to prevent all vulnerabilities, all bugs. So we have to be able to fix bugs after the software they infect has been deployed. Now, just as some vulnerabilities are easier to prevent than others, some vulnerabilities are easier to find than others. Now, we've had success at finding the easiest vulnerabilities, the low-hanging fruit that Perri talked about earlier. However, for more pernicious vulnerabilities, like the memory corruption vulnerabilities we've been talking about, automation hasn't worked as well. Finding such bugs is often extremely costly, requiring extensive effort, manual effort by experts. And that's something that many software companies just can't afford. Those observations leave us in a state where fully automatic tools are currently technically infeasible, and manual expertise is currently too expensive. So DARPA went after the middle ground. Can we decrease the cost of manual expert analysis by introducing as much automation as possible, guided by humans? And can we decrease the level of expertise required from those humans? These are the questions that were tackled in the CHESS program. Now, CHESS tools have led to detection of hundreds of vulnerabilities in commonly used software, including 5 critical vulnerabilities in Adobe products running on over 1 billion devices. Of course, looking at the ecosystem, hackers also have to find vulnerabilities. But they're looking at other people's code, which is, of course, even harder than finding vulnerabilities in your own code. And so when they're doing their cost-benefit analysis, they're going to try to minimize the cost of finding those vulnerabilities. So here's the thing. You don't have to find a vulnerability if you planted it in the first place, which is what Russia did with the SolarWinds attack. Now, our software is built on software that's open to the public and maintained by volunteers who are often underfunded and desperate for help. The state of the open source software ecosystem is illustrated by the cartoon on the slide, which is famous for its accuracy. Free open source software forms the bedrock of our virtual world, and anyone can submit a software change. Of course, such change, they do have to be reviewed by maintainers, but in many cases, such maintainers are also volunteers or paid by nonprofit foundations. Carefully vetting all proposed changes is costly and time-consuming. It's an area that's ripe for supply chain attackers who are doing that cost-benefit analysis. So understanding that cost-benefit analysis the attackers are doing and the resulting attractiveness of these supply chain attacks, DARPA created the Social Cyber AIE to explore the community aspects of open source software and to identify supply chain attacks as early as possible. So now I'm going to hand the baton back to Perri so she can talk about the bottom 2 layers of that Swiss cheese stack.
So unfortunately, sometimes our attackers are going to be able to get past our attempts to prevent vulnerabilities and to fix them. And so once they're in, they may just be on one component. They don't control your entire computer, your entire network. So it's very important to contain them. And so how do we isolate them and prevent them from doing other malicious activity? In our industry, we often call this a sandbox. But as anyone who has kids knows, sandboxes don't always keep the sand in the box. And so I want us to actually think about sandboxes kind of like biosafety labs. These come at multiple levels, and they take precautions to prevent what can enter and what can escape. But there's a very high cost to building them. It also takes a lot of time. And the precautions used introduce a lot of friction to actually performing the activities within the lab. But they're necessary to prevent very dangerous microbes from escaping. And so you want to use that cost when it makes sense. And the same is true for sandboxes in software security. So attackers like to use Word documents, for instance, to get into your computer. And so Microsoft has a sandbox in Microsoft Word that essentially turns off a lot of the features used by attackers in Word until you tell it that this is a trusted document. Your websites, your browser tabs are going to be sandboxed. Your phone apps are actually sandboxed from each other and from the underlying operating system. And your employer is likely sandboxing you. This is the idea behind zero trust security. Just because an attacker takes over your corporate accounts, they should be able to take over the entire corporate network. But again, sandboxing has this performance cost. And so when CHERI was developed, not only did it implement pointer checking, but it also implemented sandboxing technology that could be leveraged with a reduction in that performance cost. And so, for instance, the individual pictures on the website might be able to be sandboxed without your web page taking forever to load. But what if your sandbox gets hacked? And so when Kathleen was talking about HACMS earlier, she asked, well, what makes sense to apply something as complex as formal methods to? Cars, helicopters, well, sandboxes. They're a little less fun than helicopters, but they're incredibly important. And actually, on the HACMS program, when Kathleen was talking about how the red team was given access, full reign over one component, but they weren't able to break out, that's because that component, that SEL4 microkernel, was acting as a sandbox. And it was able to do so in part because it was formally verified to check that it didn't have vulnerabilities and that its sandboxing technology was effective. But unfortunately, no matter our containment measures, some pathogens are going to escape. And we have to be able to rapidly detect them and respond. And this is really a needle in a haystack problem. Your computer, all of your devices, they're running millions of instructions a second. And they have thousands of processes. These are all performing a variety of tasks. And frankly, attackers have gotten very good at hiding within the noise. They masquerade as a normal process. But of course, if you've ever run antivirus software, you know how it can slow you down significantly. That's because it's sifting through to find the signal in the noise. And so we run again into the problem of performance versus security. And then if you zoom out to the entire network, now you have to contend with millions, or I should say, tons of devices all running millions of instructions, all with thousands of processes. And so you're trying to find needles in haystacks, but you're also trying to remove that needle smoothly without actually taking down the rest of the network. So this is the problem. These are the problems, I should say, that DARPA CHASE was designed to address. And one of the ways in which DARPA CHASE does this is by leveraging those kind of human-computer partnerships that Kathleen was talking about on DARPA CHESS. So DARPA CHASE uses automation to identify likely indicators of attack on corporate networks, and then passes those off to expert analysts to be able to apply their expertise, but just on likely indicators of attacks rather than on all of that data at once, which would be impossible. And so CHASE is trying to protect and remediate networks at scale. And actually, CHASE technology on a real network was able to identify indicators of an attack by the same actors that carried out that SolarWinds attack. But there are some networks that are so critical that that it's not enough to just apply the techniques that we apply to our typical corporate networks. And these may be, for instance, our nation's power grids. DARPA designed an entire program around securing these power grids because of just how critical they are to our national security. For instance, if our last layer of that Swiss cheese is our most pessimistic scenario, assuming the attacker gets in, DARPA Radix goes one step further and assumes the attacker gets in, takes control of the entire power grid, embeds themselves, and then takes that power grid offline. And that means to get this power grid back up, you have to perform a black start. You have to get it up and running without an external power source. And you have to do that with attackers embedded in it. And these are highly skilled nation-state attackers that we're thinking about here. And so we've discussed cost-benefit analysis quite a lot today. And how does the criticality of the system being protected relate to the security investment it requires? And because power grids top that list, it wasn't enough for DARPA to just train and develop this technology on simulations. So DARPA went out and got an island, Plum Island in New York. And here was where Radix was able to develop tools and techniques to restart to perform a black start with attacker presence, and was able to actually demonstrate the feasibility of doing that.
Right. So throughout these layers, DARPA is focusing on 3 key technologies: automation, formal methods, and human-computer partnerships. Each of these technologies plays a key role in allowing us to improve the defense at a reasonable cost, while also addressing or improving performance, scale, and ease of use. But how these are applied is equally important. We have to strategically leverage the cutting-edge research if we want to outrun tomorrow's attackers, which means we have to apply these techniques to problems like compartmentalization, assurance, and transparency. Perri?
And DARPA is about looking forward. We don't just have to deal with the realities of today, but we have to anticipate the realities of tomorrow. In the future, our attack surface will expand even more rapidly as it has in the past, with the ballooning of the Internet of Things and with further global connectivity. And so despite increased investment in security, future defenders are going to have a lot more to defend. And they're still going to contend with scarce resources. Conversely, attackers are going to benefit from this increased attack surface. They're going to become more effective. But that's not to leave you with a pessimistic picture, because in fact, as we've discussed today, the problem is not as vast as it may seem. Although there is more attack surface, the offense doesn't have endless resources to attack it. And so by understanding where attackers will apply their own scarce resources and how they can perform cost-benefit analysis, we can give the defense something to beat the offense at their own game. And further, by creating defense that extract the most protection for the least cost to the defenders, we maximize our impact. And this is DARPA's goal, to prevent and impose strategic surprise. And in this case, we're trying to beat an increasingly powerful offense through the smart, specific, and strategic application of next-generation technology that's really designed to secure reality.
We need your help to make this vision a reality. DARPA is only successful as the researchers who choose to work with us. We've spent today highlighting some of the success of those researchers in the past little while. Their research will only become more effective in the coming years as we face tomorrow's challenges. But we also need the help of people who haven't worked with DARPA in the past, people who can offer crucial new insights that help us fight this challenge. Cyber is a domain where the reality is constantly changing, and we need to have the best that the country has to offer from people from a wide variety of different backgrounds with a wide variety of different kinds of skills if we're going to overcome this challenge. So if you have an idea today for how to do this, we really want to hear from you. And if at some point in the future you have a DARPA-sized idea, please consider coming to DARPA as a program manager. We are always hiring. Thank you for your attention. And we now have time for some questions. So you want to read the
So
question?
I'll throw you the first
Sure,
one.
please.
Okay, so Kathleen, what lessons can be gleaned from the ongoing war in Ukraine, and how are they informing DARPA's research focus in this space?
Right. So some of the lessons from Ukraine is we did see at the very beginning of the conflict in Ukraine that cyber was used to take out some of the communications infrastructure. The Viasat modems were hacked in a way that knocked out communication infrastructure that the Ukrainian military and civil government were using, as well as controlling wind farms in France. It was a US company that was attacked. We're also seeing tons and tons, like the level of cyber attacks going on in Ukraine is unmatched. So it's hard to see how much that cyber is affecting, those cyber attacks is affecting or not affecting the ongoing conflict. Obviously the kinetic is having very, very significant effects. The cyber is kind of under the radar. It's also the case that Ukraine has been the victim of cyber attacks, constant cyber attacks from Russia since at least 2014, and that they are, as a result, likely one of the best defended cyber countries in the world. So with like all the fog of war, it's really kind of hard to tell what the long-term lessons will be. One of the things that's also really interesting is that before February, the middle of February, Ukraine had a law that said that all of the government data and processing centers for government data had to be in the country. In the middle of February, they passed a law changing that, and they outsourced. They took all the data that was in their data centers in Ukraine, and they shipped it out into other parts of Europe. And within the first few weeks of the war, the data centers in Ukraine were destroyed. So if they hadn't done that outsourcing, all of the software that was sort of running the Ukrainian government would have been destroyed. So it's an interesting kind of flipping on the head of we must have the data in the country to be safe. And in their case, it was like the data has to be out of the country to be safe. It's also a case where kinetic effects were used to impact cyber as opposed to cyber effects being used to impact kinetic effects, so kind of the opposite direction that we usually see. So I think that the jury is out on to what extent cyber will be effective in future wars. We know that it's super effective in terms of espionage, information gathering kinds of activities. Certainly, China has used it extremely effectively. So I think the lesson is the jury's out on what the effects will be long term. We do know that there's a ton of stuff going on, and we also know that companies are playing a key role in the defense of Ukraine. So Microsoft has been very public about how they are helping Ukraine defend itself against the Russian attacks. They have published at least 2 reports on what they have found in the process. And I believe there are other companies that are being less highly visible, but are still helping what's going on. So it's another interesting juxtaposition of military and corporate efforts to help defend Ukraine. So can I ask you this question?
Please.
So Perri, should certain classes of software be considered critical resources from a protection standpoint?
So going back to what you were describing earlier with the state of open source security, absolutely, there are open source projects that form the bedrock of our critical resources. But further, they form the bedrock of, for instance, the Linux kernel is going to be very prevalent within power grids, within other critical resources, water systems. It's also what's probably running on your router at home. It's might be even running on your computer. It's often running on the servers that you're interacting with, right? And so this is undergirding our critical resources, is just really undergirding our society. And this isn't just true for the Linux kernel, it's also true for open source cryptographic libraries like OpenSSL and other fundamental critical software. And actually, over the last couple of years, we've seen a shift in policy towards how we address these open source projects that are so prevalent, investing more resources in securing them. I think this is a very complex problem because software is so diverse and it's very difficult to defend it in a centralized fashion that we have to apply a number of approaches, as we were discussing today, to be able to do that. Oh, perfect. Let me actually ask you this question. Kathleen was actually the program manager for HACMS. And so how is your research, for example, HACMS, being used in the real world today?
Right. So the success of HACMS at the beginning of phase 1, that was a really surprising result. DARPA didn't expect to have the red team be able to fail at the end of phase 1. And so the program managers who took over from me started to work on transitioning to many other platforms. So by the end of the program, there were like 12 or 13 different platforms, from UAVs and trucks and satellite systems that were working on adopting the technology from HACMS into those platforms already before the program was ended. So that's one path where technology from HACMS started to get out into militarily relevant systems. Another path is Amazon Web Services has really doubled down on the importance of verification. So I think at this point they've hired pretty much everybody. Of course, not really everybody, that's hyperbolic, but a vast number of the performers who worked on HACMS now work for Amazon Web Services, assuring their cloud software. So the capability is continuing to be developed at length, but a lot of it is within Amazon Web Services. And we are now out of time, so I thank you for your attention, and we'll be out at the break, which is immediately after this, to answer any further questions you may have. Thank you very much for your attention. Take care.
Thank you.